So, Lower Canada Revolts, 1837. That's the flag, by the way, of the rebels in Lower Canada. Okay? So Lower Canada revolts in greater numbers. Okay, there's about an estimated amount of 13,000, as opposed to the 1,000 in Upper. And the rebels are generally 13,000 rebels are imprisoned at this point. Okay, sorry, there's a load of people. 13,000, estimated rebels are imprisoned. So that's how we know in terms of numbers, I suppose. So in October, paramilitary is much more organized. We're talking about the rebels are much more organized. And what I was talking about with Wilfred Nelson in the Confederation of the Six Counties, it's basically the Confederation meets to turn to revolt. Okay, so we're talking about, think of it like a House of Committee or something. I can't remember exactly what it was in America. But that's essentially what happens. It's much more American style here as well. So November, so literally about a month later, or just under that actually, street fighting begins in Montreal, and arrest warrants are made for all of the Patrio leaders, okay, including Papineau. So there is an absolute, you can absolutely see just how serious they take it, that they have to imprison loads and arrest all the leaders, okay? In fact, in December, martial law is declared. There are loyalist reprisals, okay? And Gosford, who's the lieutenant governor at the time, declares control restored, okay? So, in December, it almost looks like, again, obviously the rebellion doesn't go on for that long. It really only goes on for about just under 2 months. However, God bless you, it is a lot more steps have to be made. And I suppose in some way, rather than, for example, in America, where these steps were taken a lot slower, in some way here, for example, they decided, well, we've learned our lesson, let's be much quicker about this and declare martial law immediately and again, hit them where it hurts. But it's a much easier, again, rebellion to put down than in America, because it's a much smaller amount of land, okay? Much fewer towns and cities. Okay? We're talking about Montreal, we're talking about Quebec City, which even then is very, very small at this point in time. And that's really mostly about it. Maybe it was 1 or 2 smaller towns. I mean, even Ottawa isn't that big at this point. So we're talking about really a very, very isolated scene. It's just there was lots of rebels included in this one, of course. By the 10th of February 1838, the 1791 Constitution is suspended and the governor is given special powers, essentially, okay? So special powers to deal with the situation and make sure this doesn't happen again or doesn't get even worse, okay? So whilst Gosford does declare control restored, it doesn't mean to say that the danger has passed. So once again, prove that this rebellion is much, much greater in Lower Canada than in Upper Canada. Okay? And it's not until April that martial law is revoked. So the situation has now been, for all intents and purposes, normalized. But that is until November, when there is a second rebellion with exiled patriots coming back in from America, essentially, and failing to raid along the border, okay? So we're talking about a very, very small, isolated incident there. But it just goes to show that, of course, whilst 13,000 rebels were imprisoned, a lot of them, as always, like in Upper Canada, fled to America. The only difference is that they tried again, but these were tiny little raids along the border, which Britain then went to America and said, look, can you stop this from happening in America? Went, yeah, absolutely. Arrested Mackenzie, stop these raids from happening. So, essentially, whilst this was a very small affair, if you compare it to the American Revolution, in terms of, for the British Empire, this is actually much more devastating than you think. Whilst the numbers are low, it's further proof that the British Empire, to the British for sure, and even to us as historians, is still quite vulnerable to something that might happen in America. Who's to say, and it does in a way happen, that this could happen in Australia? Could this happen and it did, in India? Could this happen in loads of other places? The West Indies? Could this happen in any other white settler colony, like the very slow-growing one in South Africa, for example, and all the other areas? This is actually much, much more dangerous to the British, in so much as they thought, the British, that this kind of rebellion, this kind of revolt of a secessionist rebellion, was in the past, in the history books. That's why they had the Constitution Act. They thought that they'd solved it. But this is proof that they hadn't. So that's why this is much more damaging than you think. The actual event, not that bad. They retained control. But the fact that it happened is the damaging bit, the damaging element of Lower. That's why Lower Canada is really, really interesting. Of course, Upper is damaging in its own right, because a lot of them are still British. But here, it's just proof that the British Empire is, in some way, built very precariously on the trust of lots of people not to dislike the current system. And that's obviously not going to carry on. Remember they essentially are rebelling after 50 years of a system. What's to say that's going to happen in 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years? Okay, remember, keep this at the back of your mind. People do not build an empire for an expiration date, although some people will say that, for example, in India, Britain was preparing them for independence. I mean, that's up to you whether you think that's true or not. But usually when you're building an empire, you're building it to last, and to last certainly after your lifetime and hopefully your children's lifetime. When you have something like this that happens, it puts all of the rest of the empire into doubt, in many ways, especially those under the Constitution Act. So think about it in that way, and it really shows to you just how damaging this was, certainly to the British psyche, if nothing else. So remember, at this point in Lower Canada, French Canadians are still inherently, and they're always going to be different. And they will always prevent a majority of British in the lower house, in the legislative assembly, okay? So you're always going to have that as a problem. So how are you going to prevent their majorities? So now we're thinking, so how are we going to make sure this, in terms of just in Lower Canada, doesn't happen again? We'll get to Lord Durham whenever, in terms of a more long-lasting approach. But in terms of how do we sort out Lower Canada, well, they've got a big problem, because the French will always have a majority in the lower house. So they think, well, in order to solve it, we need to prevent that from occurring, and they need to reduce the influence of the Chateau clique. So at least they show that we need to stop this cronyism. We need to stop a very small group of wealthy British businessmen in sort of direct or indirect control of politics, and certainly in almost complete control, or certainly a lot of it, in economics. And they had to deal with the French land system, French land tenure, okay? Because they believed that it was the cause of, and maybe it is, cause of economic issues. How do we know this? There wasn't that much economic hardship in Upper Canada. The only problem is that Upper Canada has better fertile land, but again, I'm not entirely sure how much that is essentially true, okay? So at least they understand the problems now here, but it's a much bigger picture than that they need to sort out, okay? It's a bit like going back to the drawing board. And that's very demoralizing for a lot of people, certainly for an empire, okay? Does that make sense? Any questions about this? No? Any questions online? Okay, so last thing I'm going to mention, and I'm going to shoot through this, is could revolution have come to Canada? Could we have seen American-style revolution? Okay? Essentially, the quick answer is no. The military were able to disperse up to 1,000, crowds of 1,000 with absolute ease, okay? We're not talking about really, really vehemently militant crowds, okay? Nothing like it in America. You're not getting the amount of people, I suppose, because thinking about the comparisons, the Americans had trained or prepared for longer. They had 2 years essentially or 2 or 3 years of unbroken silence in many ways with their committees of correspondence to build up some sort of local militia in some way. And that had been there for a while. Whereas the military in Canada were directly, that had a massive presence from Britain itself. Okay? And Lower Canada was deemed more, indeed it was, deemed more important to the British Empire. Hence why they had a big military there. And so the revolts were taken seriously by the British, as opposed to in America where they thought that this could be dealt with as locally as possible. Mm-hmm.
Why was Lower Canada deemed more important?
More people.
Oh, I see.
Much more people. And essentially you're controlling French people. Very important that way.
Yeah.
Prestigious, absolutely. In a prestigious way, yeah, completely. And the infrastructure being built up there, whereas in Upper Canada, it's still a work in progress. Okay, whereas there, it pretty much had been developed from a long time ago. About 100 years, even less so, I suppose. Were the revolts serious? Yes. In some ways, it could have gotten worse. If the British hadn't taken it seriously, it could have gotten worse. I'm not saying that essentially that Canada could have had its own revolution, but essentially aggression could have been much worse. Okay. In terms of a sparse population density, it made a revolutionary fervour harder to spread. Okay, we're talking about, when we talk about these towns and cities, and there's very, very few of them in Lower Canada. There's only 1 or 2. I told you, there's only 2 or 3 even. What you have is the land tenure system. You've got landlords and you have tenants, so they're evenly spread out rather than in individual cities a lot of the time. Okay. Most of the events happened in the winter of 1837. And if anyone knows, and I certainly know what winter's like in Quebec, it's absolutely freezing. You've got temperatures of minus 27 on a good day, okay, in January. And so you're not talking about a good atmosphere in order to have a revolution. But I suppose America was not far away. It was a spectre of history. We're talking, remember the revolution, American Revolution had occurred, certainly still in people's lifetimes. You all right? You like you're in trouble? Can I go? So it was always there, so I suppose people were always on their guard in many ways, okay? So I suppose in your own time, I want you to really think about this if you're serious with your work, is make comparisons between the US and Canadian events, as I've tried to talk about. What were the contrasts between the two in terms of the build-up? I've given you a couple of ideas. And why do the Americans win and why do the Canadians lose? Well, French Canadians in many ways, but why did they lose? So have a think about that in order to now put a lid on the rebellions in Canada, okay? Does that make sense? Do you understand the differences between the two rebellions? Are there any questions? No? Now it is time to go.